mic on? Yes. Okay. Make sure that that's online. Mute it. Yeah. Good. Cool. Go back to that. Good. Great. All right. Okay. As a reminder, especially for my online folks, because I have a hard time getting my papers for a lot of online people. The paper is due in 2 weeks, so please get that to me. And for everyone in here, if you can bring them to me physically, that'd be great. For you online, email them to me at my Princess Marion email address. Attach it as a document, please. Don't do like Google Docs and send me a link and have to do all the permission crap, because that takes too long, and by the time that gets through, I'm going to be 6 papers down. So if you need to send it through email, that's fine, but attach it. Word document, PDF document, something like that. Okay, any questions from y'all in here? All good? Okay. And also, as a reminder, while the first paper is on, like, or the default is, did the French Revolution end with Napoleon, you can do whatever. I mean, we've got a whole test worth of material before that, and you can go up to, I guess, I'm going to do like with my other class, like 1900, if you want to go that far. Because the second paper is going to be like World War I-ish, so don't go that far. But you're welcome to expand if there's something else you want to talk about. Absolutely, yes. You're more than welcome, because yeah, as we have noted, he is rather interesting. Just to have survived the French Revolution. Yes, for sure. There's lots of individuals that are interesting to talk about. Lots of events going on. I mean, again, just the 30 Years' War and Gustavus Adolphus and the various kings in France and all over. So yeah, plenty of stuff. And like you said, Sieyès. Yeah, so yeah, absolutely. Yeah, those of you online, if you want to do something besides the default, just email me to make sure you're not doing something that's maybe too broad for a 2 to 3 page paper. If you wanted to do like if you want to do a biography on Napoleon, that would probably be a little bit too broad, because there's been so much written on him. Sieyès, for example, is a bit of a smaller character in the world. Napoleon, you might want to specify like a specific time in his life, like the early life of Napoleon, or like Napoleon in the Republican Army, or Napoleon like as an emperor, or something like that. That would, you should split that a little bit. But yeah, so that's very good. And again, there's a ton of stuff you can do. European history there's so much going on. Okay, so we ended here. I mean, like technically we ended with Trafalgar, which is here, and then I had my little extra PowerPoint on that, with Nelson getting himself shot because he went out in full regalia, which you don't do. I mean, like today, you don't even salute in the field anymore, because you never know when there's a sniper, and if someone's saluting someone else, that other person is probably important. So yeah, you don't salute. You don't bring attention to yourself as someone important on the battlefield. Anyway, as we mentioned, the Grand Armée was the master of the continent. Napoleon overran Vienna with complete, just, well, as we said, no opposition whatsoever. So, With the taking of Vienna, the Habsburg Empire folded, and this pretty much ended the Holy Roman Empire. Napoleon basically ended what Charlemagne had begun. Austria sticks around. Austria doesn't go away. I mean, Austria's still around today. But as far as, like, Austria as a significant power on the world stage, it more or less ends here. I mean, they're still around in World War I, but they're barely a thing. And by World War II, they're just absorbed by Germany. Yeah, so this is the beginning of Austria becoming what Spain had become, where they're just sort of an echo of their former self. The remaining armies were followed into Austerlitz. Napoleon split his army to flank the enemy, which further split the Austrians off from the Russians. The Austrians surrendered, and the Russians were forced into Poland. So, again, Austria is now just completely out of the game. Now, while, again, we saw here, Austria, the country, is over, the army was still around. Well, now the Austrian army is gone. So it's just Russia that's left. Now, Napoleon was running roughshod over Austria, which is like right in Prussia's backyard. So Prussia declared war on France, and in a move that still shocks me, Napoleon just rolled in and just knocked Prussia out, just like right away. Prussia, which is, again, like the core of what would become Germany. Morning. And as we're going to see in later wars, does the same to France later. But here, Napoleon just whips Prussia. They were not out after the Battle of Jena, or Vienna probably, since it's Central Europe. Then they continued pushing the Russians. They rallied Polish forces. He promised Poland, said, hey, we're going to push the Russians out and you can have Poland back. And the Polish were like, hey, cool, we haven't had Poland in a while. So the Battle of Friedland, the Russians were backed to a river and crushed. This led to the Treaty of Tilsit on July 7th, 1807, where a specially built raft was floated into the Niemen River, which is the border between, I think this is the border between Poland and Russia. So it's like the natural, like neutral zone, because, I mean, you can't own a river, not really. Russia had to join France's embargo on Britain, which is we'll talk more about the continental system, which I briefly mentioned before. Prussia lost a third of its land, which was used to make the Duchy of Warsaw, which is Poland, and had to reduce its army to 42,000, which we know Germany's really good about reducing its army and totally sticking to that. So here's the Treaty of Tilsit being signed on the Niemen River. That's the little barge that they built, and they've got a little like a little greenhouse looking thing on top of it where they went in and sat down and signed the thing. This to me is interesting. So the Treaty of Tilsit is actually important as well as the Niemen River. So again, the date, I don't care. Although actually that's like right between our important July date and their important July date, but that's not important. Treaty of Tilsit, Niemen River, I thought that was neat, so it's here. However, while this once again pacified the continent, what country is France? Does France not have a treaty with still that they've been fighting this entire time? England. Always England. That is, that will always be the answer until like literally World War One. And it was that would have almost actually been the answer in World War One. That's a neat little sidebar when we get there. England almost was on the side of Germany in World War One. Anyway, so as we mentioned, France wasn't able to invade England. We had that weird picture I found of all the attempts to invade England. So Napoleon decided to use the continental system. They would cut Britain off from mainland Europe and make it so that England couldn't trade with Europe. Which, I mean, it sucked because Europe's right there. I mean, England's sort of done it to itself recently with Brexit because the English government's stupid. But as I mentioned on Monday, England has its entire empire at this time. They've got Canada, they've got the Caribbean, they've got freaking India. I think they've got Australia at this point now. They're trading partners with the U.S. Yeah, not trading with Europe is a pain, but it's not hurting England that much. In fact, it hurt Russia the most because Russia is really landlocked. And as far as a port, the most they can get to is England. So yeah, and Portugal isn't part of the continental system. So Portugal is just freely trading with Britain, which obviously pissed off Napoleon. So Napoleon decided to invade Portugal. Well, as we know, France doesn't really have a navy anymore. So the only way to get to Portugal is to go through Spain. Now, Spain also isn't technically part of the French Empire, but they're an ally. But sending troops through another sovereign nation isn't usually well received. You usually want to do that with ships and stuff. But after Trafalgar, especially because, again, if you recall, the Spanish had a lot of ships in the Battle of Trafalgar, and they lost a lot of guys in the Battle of Trafalgar. Oh, actually, let me back up. I meant to tell you guys this on Monday, but I forgot. So, after the Battle of Trafalgar, there's a code when it comes to naval battles that once the battle's over, you pull guys out of the ocean. Anybody that survived the battle, you pull out of the ocean and you keep as prisoners, but you save. You don't let these people drown. The Spanish sailors were immediately returned to Spain. The French sailors were brought back to England as prisoners. The reason for that wasn't just because the English hate the French, but because the French were still seen as this godless country because, again, during the French Revolution, they were anti-Christian. And while the English are a Protestant nation and the Spanish are a Catholic nation, they're still Christian. So it's we might not see eye to eye, but these friggin' French, man, you guys can go home. It's cool. And they were right near Spain anyway, so they just sailed by Spain and sent them home. And then the French had to be in prison for a couple of years before they were sent back home, which is just very English. But the official reason was, and again, it wasn't just English pettiness, but it was because of the whole godlessness of France. That they were kept in prison. So I thought that was very amusing, and I wanted to make sure I included that. I just thought it was very funny. It's pull the guys out of the sea, see which side they're on. It's oh, you're Spanish? Spain's right there. We'll dry you off and send you home. So that was quite amusing. Anyway, Spain wasn't too keen on working with France anymore. So to ensure Spain's loyalty, Napoleon had the Spanish king step down, which is to say, forced the Spanish king to step down, and had his, I knew his brother's name was Joseph, had his brother Joseph become the ruler. His brother wasn't really good as a ruler. So he had a bunch of heavy-handed reforms which pissed off the Spanish. And if you know anything about the Spanish or really anyone of Spanish descent, which includes any Latin Americans, they're very strongly opinionated, I think is the best way to put it. They're fiery, I think is another good way to put it. So they were very angry, and there was a rebellion in Madrid on May 2nd of 1808, which was brutally put down by the Spanish army, which, of course, only pissed off the Spanish more. They don't play around. So while Spain was basically in open rebellion against France, Portugal basically invited England in to land and send troops through Portugal into Spain to start to invade France. And okay, my shoes are going untied. So this force was led by Sir Arthur Wellesley, who later became the Duke of Wellington, who I briefly mentioned before is the big hero of the final battle against Napoleon. This became known as the Peninsular War, which lasted for 6 years. And while this didn't really ever lead to France being invaded, it did force France to shift a lot of its forces from Europe, or from Central Europe, into Spain, and allowed for Austria to once again rise up in 1809. And also, here is May 2nd, the execution of the Spanish rebels. This is by Goya. This is a very famous art piece. You may have seen it before. So this is the rebels from May 2nd that are being executed by the Spanish army. Lot of symbolism here. For one, the guards, you can't even see their faces. They're just like inhuman executioners. Pretty obvious symbolism here of the main guy in the middle. Outstretched arms, white shirt, lots of light. Yeah. Also, heavily Catholic nation. If you don't get that, big church in the background. Yeah. Goya was a really famous artist. I say was. He is a really famous artist. But he was a big artist at the time. Okay. So the occupation of the rest of Europe and these ideals from Napoleon, this idea of modernization, enlightenment, etc., caused what will become known as nationalism. And modern nationalism isn't quite the same as back then. It would be what we call modern day patriotism, where you're proud of your country, despite its flaws. Modern day nationalism is you're proud of your country and you hate everybody else. So when we talk about nationalism here, we're more talking about modern patriotism, where because back then, before this, you rallied to a king or a noble family. It wasn't about where you lived or what language you spoke, um, or your history or whatever. It was whatever noble family you fought under, or what king, your family fought under for generations. But now these nations came together with history, language, traditions. Once again, going back to Saez, where the people made the nation, not the ruler, not some noble lineage, but the people within an area, the people comprising the land, made this up. And in fact, and I've learned, is this actually in the book, or was this something that I remembered from? Yeah, this was actually in the book. It is telling that one great historian of modern Germany opened his book with the phrase, "In the beginning was Napoleon." Because before this, Germany, as I've mentioned many, many times, was just like a region. They all spoke German, or at least a version of German, and they were a bunch of little independent states. They did their own thing. Like I said, Prussia was like the biggest of these, but it wasn't trying to make anything more than what it was. You had Saxony and Burgundy and all these other places that were their own independent little things. The idea of a greater Germany wasn't really a thing. Not yet. So, 1809, Austria was going to try again. Napoleon, though, despite being busy with Spain, saw it coming, so he was ready for them. Battle of Wagram. In a 2-day battle, 320,000 troops met on the field, which was the largest battle Europe had ever seen up to that point in history. This was the sort of battle you wouldn't see again until like World War I. This was... Before this point, when you would have a battle, you could ride up on a hill on your horse and see the whole battle and like direct what's going on from the hilltop with like your sword or whatever. But this battle was so big you couldn't see the whole thing. It stretched so far in every direction that you literally couldn't see the entire battle, which was unheard of up until that point. Also, Napoleon's Habsburg wife, so he had another wife who now was a Habsburg, bore him an heir, Francois Charles Joseph Bonaparte, who Napoleon called the Eaglet because he was super into eagles apparently. And this was to be his heir. No one was cool with that but Napoleon, because they really didn't want like an imperial lineage. Russia was pissed about the whole continental system because, again, they were suffering more than anybody, including Britain. Also, France supporting Poland, which Russia has been enemies with for ever. So, again, Napoleon knew that Russia was going to cause trouble. So Napoleon decided to hit Russia first. He crossed the Niemen River on June 24th, 1812, with an army of 600,000 men, which, again, like, you didn't see those numbers in that time of history. Like, that is insane. But Russia fought differently. They would fight a little bit and then retreat, and they'd burn everything on the way back. An army of 600,000 men could not bring enough supplies to survive. They would, loot and take from the villagers what they needed. Well, if the Russian army burned everything in front of the French, they had no food. Tsar Alexander refused to surrender, despite the fact that Russia was not winning this war. Also, before Napoleon even made it to Moscow, the Russian army burned it down. Alexander is like, screw it, we're going to abandon Moscow and burn it down. We're not even going to let him have the pleasure of burning down the city. So on October 19th, as winter is beginning to happen, Napoleon decided we need to get the heck out of Russia. Well, winter comes early in Russia. So winter's starting to hit. Russian forces are harassing the army, so they're like attacking from the back, from the sides, and forces are going out in front of the army and continuing to burn stuff. So they're taking a different path out, hoping to find food, but they're essentially starving out Napoleon's army. So by the time Napoleon got out of Russia, he had 30,000 men left. 30,000 out of 600,000. And very little of that was from combat. It was an extremely costly invasion. And once again, we're going to see this happen again in a later incident. So here is Napoleon crossing the river with all his boys. Again, lots of guys. There's Napoleon and his guys on horses. I guess this is still going into Russia. Then I've got them going back out. Looking not so great. We got guys frozen on the ground. Napoleon's horse don't look so good. They were eating their shoes because their shoes are, made out of leather, and you can technically eat leather, but now their feet are freezing. Anytime a horse fell, they'd immediately jump on the horse and start eating it because that was all the meat they had. It was extremely bad. And I would consider this the major turning point, personally, is the attempted invasion of Russia. Because it wasn't just an army of 600,000. Where'd my mouse go? It wasn't just an army of 600,000. These were his elites. These were his troops that had been with him for the most part since the beginning. Now, of course, a lot of these were, new recruits or conscripts or whatever, but any reinforcements that he brought in, any replacements that he brought in would not be as good as these troops. These 30,000 men that made it back with him, those would be his core guys, but this would never be replaced. Even if he got 600,000 again, only those 30,000 would be as good as he had before. Because you can't replace that training. You can't replace that experience, which is what ends up happening. So the Prussians actually allied with the Russians, which, as we'll see in later chapters, is pretty surprising. So they pushed the French out of Saxony. There was a small armistice, which is sort of like a ceasefire. Napoleon rebuilt his army. Austria joined up with Russia and Prussia. And as I had just said, despite Napoleon rebuilding his army, the army was much younger and inexperienced. Again, he had that core. He had the guys that got out of Russia. And while he had built the numbers back up, they were green. They could shoot a gun. They could fire a cannon, but they didn't have the literal years of experience under Napoleon, of working together, of just knowing what the guy next to them was thinking. You can't replace that. So in Leipzig, this 3-day battle 90,000 men were killed in the Battle of Nations. Battle of the Nations, I should say. Um, Napoleon lost because, again, he didn't have the army that he went into Russia with. He tried to abdicate in favor of his son, but the victorious armies told him they were not having that. They put Louis's brother, who is now Louis the 18th, on the throne. So we skipped a couple of numbers. So it was Louis the 16th was the one that died. So I guess we skipped the 17th. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. So we've got Louis the 18th on the throne. Napoleon was exiled to Elba. Elba is only like a couple of miles off the coast of France. I want to say he was given like something like 100 troops to like do mock drills with because they didn't want him to get bored. They treated him really well, like for basically a disgraced would-be emperor. They treated him pretty well. Unfortunately, a would-be emperor got bored really fast and got in a rowboat and made his way back to France. And started marching towards Paris. And just random people started joining up. It's like, oh, Napoleon's back. Let's help him. So he had an army again by the time he made it back to Paris. But they were random schmucks. Now he did have some actual like soldiers that were like, oh crap, Napoleon's back. Let's jump in with him. But for the most part, his army was like farmers and just random dudes. This was even less than he had at the Battle of Nations. Needless to say, the Allies in Europe, once they heard that Napoleon was back, they were like, we got to stop this now. We've had enough of Napoleon. But once again, Napoleon wasn't going to sit back and wait on them to attack him. He hit the British and Prussian forces in Belgium and almost won. Despite the ragtag, barely trained army he had, he hit the, what I would say, two strongest armies in Europe at the time and almost won. He forced the Prussians to retreat and almost overwhelmed the British, who were fighting under the Duke of Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo. The Prussians, though, returned and they managed to overwhelm Napoleon. He was then exiled to St. Helena, which is much further off the coast of France. He can't make it back by rowboat. And he died in 1821. Maybe of stomach cancer, maybe of poisoning, we're not sure. They didn't want to execute him because he would then be a martyr, and it would have probably caused another revolution. So they're like, we're just going to exile him and let him die of probably natural causes. There isn't really enough evidence to say he was definitely poisoned, but that's a distinct possibility. And if he was poisoned, it wasn't like we saw in, say, Rome, where it was one meal and he just falls over dead. It was like a long-term, gradually shut down his system poisoning. So it was more like he probably had cancer and died, because it was like a long-term, he got worse and worse and then died. So who knows? Either way, yeah, that's it for Napoleon. There's the Duke of Wellington riding into battle all heroic-like, who, again, very nearly got his butt kicked, but the Prussians came back. There's I think this is actually the Battle of Nations. I don't think this is actually Waterloo. So, yeah, things got nuts in France. This was a big chapter. The old regimes were no longer the only way things were done. Revolts and revolutions all over the world, more than just what we talked about, not just the French Revolution, but, as we talked about, Ireland and Haiti and Poland, but even more beyond those. And while Napoleon's reign wasn't especially long. I mean, it was longer than the poor Julius Caesar. He had like a year. This would plant seeds for future nationalism, future countries that were just sort of loose regions that spoke similar languages. They will become countries that we know today, Italy and Germany, for example. And that, to me, is actually one of the most interesting parts of this era. But specifically, people realized that they had the power to shape their nations. That it wasn't up to some high-born asshole to do everything. That the people could do it. Civil equality was spread, which would shape the 19th century, which would in turn shape the 20th, and boy, that is, yeah. And we've still got like 30 minutes, so we're definitely going to get into the next chapter. So yeah, that's chapter 17. That's Napoleon and the French Revolution, or French Revolution and Napoleon. Again, the next chapter is pretty much just how everybody's dealing with what Napoleon left behind. So let's get into that. Any questions on this from you guys? All right. Let me check here real quick. Oh, and also, well, I say we're dealing with what Napoleon left behind, but also the Industrial Revolution. So that happens as well. And then after this is it my favorite chapter? Is that what's coming up? Ooh, I think so. Up to 1880. Yep, sure enough. All right. Chapter 19 is my favorite in both books, apparently. Okay. So let's go to chapter 18. Where did my mouse go? There it is. All right. So this chapter is called Living in the Past, Seeing the Future, Restoration, Nationalism, and Industrialization from 1815 to 1850. So we're right at the tail end of Napoleon, up to about halfway through the 19th century, getting into attempting to restore monarchs, how well that goes in some areas, not so much in other areas, and then, of course, the rise of industrialization. Although, again, we've sort of already had some level of industrialization, but we're starting to get to the second industrial revolution with, gas and steel and all of that, but we'll get there in a minute. Anyway, so the Congress of Vienna, the Concert of Europe, which was led by the Austrian Foreign Minister Clemens von Metternich, that's an Austrian name. This was Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia coming together to try and keep Napoleon from happening again. Or specifically to keep the French Revolution from happening again. This was like a really early, I guess I wouldn't say United Nations since it's just these guys. I guess a really early European Union. So it's just like the main powers in Europe coming together to ensure that we're not going to have another big revolution. Maintain the balance of power, keep revolutions from happening. And the Congress of Vienna, so the Concert of Europe is, there you are. The Concert of Europe is these countries working together. The Congress of Vienna specifically is to contain France and revolutionary thought. It's to push back against what has happened, because that caused a lot of chaos. So the things they did, they restored the Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVI's brother, Louis XVIII. Again, we just skipped a number. Why the hell not? Whatever. Again, it's just another Louis. We're in France. It's a Louis, whatever. In the Netherlands, they merged the Austrian Netherlands with the Dutch Republic to create a strong presence on the borders of France. Nobody was happy with this. I mean, the reason there was the Austrian Netherlands and the Dutch Republic is because they had been fighting for the last, 200 freaking years. But some jerk in Austria is like, oh, let's just combine these two and create like a border on France so they don't like invade the rest of Europe. Nobody was happy with that. I mean, the rest of Europe was, but nobody in the Netherlands was. We'll get to that. The German Confederation, they basically merged a bunch of the much smaller German principalities into 39 German-speaking states, which was overseen by Austria. So this is kind of, sort of, a return to the Holy Roman Empire, but not really. This is actually a step towards what will become a Greater Germany, because we now no longer have these itty-bitty little, like, here in the United States, like county-sized principalities that are completely independent from one another, and they speak their own little dialect of German, and they have their own little laws. They're slightly bigger now, but again, if you know, like, Germany's not that big. I mean, it's a fairly large country in, like, Europe, but compared to the United States, it's only, like, the size of 2 or 3 states. And it's got 39 little states in it, and that doesn't include Austria and Prussia, which, again, Prussia is, like, huge. Yeah. And again, Prussia is its own thing. It has the Rhineland and half of Saxony, and it's still technically under the oversight of Austria, but it's more powerful than it's ever been. Because, well, they had been a big help in containing France, so they're a big boy at the table now. After the 7 Years' War, they became a major nation, but after the Napoleonic Wars, they very much proved that they were not just a big nation, but they were an important nation. Anyway, here's Metternich. He's got, like, the most snowy hair I've ever seen. And we'll discuss, there's a train. We'll discuss some of these as we go along. So, the political spectrum of the era. We had the liberals who thought the moderate revolution was pretty cool. Equality was a good idea, at least among, men, because, again, this is the 1700s. Or, well, 1800s at this point. A constitution, an elected body. Voters should be landowners, but, non-Europeans in the colony shouldn't be able to vote. Just because they lived there for hundreds, if not thousands, of years before us, we can't let them vote. They've got too much melanin in their skin. They like the idea of a monarchy, but a constitutional monarchy, so basically England. But this was necessary to balance out the elected assembly. So basically, they liked what England was doing. They thought that was a pretty good idea. Pushed for the idea of a free market where neither the government or the workers influenced it. So they didn't like, say, France, where they controlled everything, or the idea of, a socialist overthrow where the workers controlled everything. They were kind of in the middle. The radicals, though, they felt like the radical revolution didn't go far enough, despite all the guillotining. Described themselves as Republicans, not the American Republicans. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were these radicals. They created what became known as communism, where the workers, or the proletariat, that's a term we will be using in the future, would rise up against the landowners, or the bourgeoisie, which is a term we've already seen, and create a classless society where workers would set the prices for their goods and all would have enough money to eat. And then we have the conservatives that felt like the people shouldn't rule, and we just need to go back to before the French Revolution and pretend like none of it ever happened. Let's go back to having kings and nobles and clergy, and all the poor people just stay poor and pretend like none of it ever happened. So, as far as who was actually being put into office, in Western Europe, France, England, Western Germany, and the Netherlands had more liberal leaders. They were pushing reform. Daniel O'Connell, for example, this was a major Irish leader. He got a seat in Parliament. Catholic emancipation was passed in Britain, so Catholics could actually take civil and military jobs. So before this point, like, Catholics were basically secondary citizens, second-class citizens, in England and also Ireland. So yeah, hey, England's finally letting like a major part of the population actually be citizens. That's cool. Jews were given citizenship in France in 1791. Boy, that's nice. In German provinces between 1808 and 1814. So again, cool. We're starting to treat people like people, at least the men, because again, 1800s. In Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe, serfs were still tied to the land until 1861, which again is still earlier than 1865. Like I said, they beat us out in the whole like slavery thing. Austria had serfdom abolished under Joseph II, but it wasn't really enforced in the Hungarian lands. Literacy was much lower in Eastern Europe than in Western Europe, and many liberals had to flee Russian restrictions or be imprisoned because Russia was, well, as I've said several times, like 200 years behind everybody else in a lot of cases. Anyway, here's Daniel O'Connell. Again, my brief time in Ireland, I've seen a lot of pictures of Mr. O'Connell. Despite the many things that have happened over the years, like, all of their heroes are so venerated, despite how many of them there are. Here it's like George Washington and like a couple of other guys. For them it's like we've got like dozens and dozens and dozens, and we love all of them and we know all of them and what all they did. It's like, Jesus, you guys. They really like their history. All right. Actually, one thing that did happen under the continental system, since they were cut off from British goods, is textile and sugar ventures were started on the continent. But once British goods were once again allowed back on the continent, these ventures shut down because, well, the British goods were cheaper and of higher quality. So, sorry guys. Britain was very much the global economic leader. Again, they had access to most of the world. They had a pretty good deal with America when it came to cheap cotton. They had access to a lot of the Caribbean when it came to accessing, sugar for the sugar plantations. Britain is, or was, like the world economy. When it came to the countryside, there was conflict over the use of the forests. In the Middle Ages, peasants typically would go to the forests to gather wood, scavenge for acorns, berries, and mushrooms to have more to eat than just like bread and essentially gruel. But now landowners were restricting them for their own resources. So there's conflict in the countryside, and once again, with like the Revolution and Napoleon's reign, there was a major blow dealt to religion. But despite, as we saw with how England treated the French prisoners, France's stance wasn't really anti-religious. It was more anti-clerical. It was this idea that they didn't want the Pope, or at least really just another authority, ruling over France's authority. Their idea was that the First Estate should be under the monarch. essentially. Um, the church got some of its clout back, but not much of its land. So all the church land that was taken and taxed and used for money for the various countries and kingdoms, they didn't get much of that back. In Western Europe, there was various religious freedom and tolerance, while in the Eastern Europe, which is to say Russia, it wasn't a safe place to be a Jew or a Christian that wasn't a Russian Orthodox. Which, again, I mean, that's just Russia. Which is actually something we were talking about in my American history class. It's like, yeah, a lot of Jews were getting the heck out of Russia because despite them having like literally the Jewish Pale, which we'll actually talk about I think later in this class, which is like, here's a place that you guys can be and we'll leave you alone, and then they didn't. It's like, oh, we're gonna come through and like murder a bunch of you. It's like, this is literally the place that's called the Jewish Pale. It's called the we'll leave you alone place. But then they didn't. Anyway. As we mentioned, this was spawned as part of revolutionary France. The Spanish, German, and Italian lands under Napoleon's thumb, this idea of nationalism, was brought forth by, once again, Saez. I told you guys he was going to be important. Even after he's not really around anymore, his ideas are still here. That the state was the people, not the ruler, not the noble house. The state was the people. And this is, I mean, I know today it's like, okay, yeah, whatever. But like back then it was revolutionary. Especially when, I mean, Italy and Germany are the biggest examples because their creation comes later and it's such a big deal. But like when you have all these little tiny states and like you're beholden to your baron or your noble lord or whatever, and you're enemies with the guy next door, and the only difference between you and the guy next door is the noble lord. You speak the same language, you've got the same religion, you've got the same like traditions and stuff, which we'll actually see more of that later as well. This was a pretty big deal. Now, it was unifying in a lot of ways, and I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but in some other ways it wasn't so much. Oh, I didn't get ahead of myself too much. Yeah, unify people within a nation like France, within geographic geographic regions that had traditions and usually languages like Germany and Italy. However, places like Austria and Russia that had lots of different ethnicities were starting to have problems because now you have a lot of different ethnic groups that want their own nation, but they're already inside of a nation. So again, like Germany and Italy, where it's like, oh, we're all the same, why don't we just join together? Instead of that, it's, oh, we're all different and we want our own thing, but we're inside of a place. We want the land that we're on. That causes a lot of issues. Yeah, as much as the conservative politicians wanted, you couldn't just turn back time. You couldn't go back to before the revolution, and they couldn't separate this idea of nationalism from centralizing power, rationalizing the state framework. With the clergy and nobility losing power, the nation and the people of the nation took more power. So as we saw last chapter, the monarchy wanted to take power from the clergy and the nobility, but they wanted it for themselves. However, as we were seeing, the people were taking power, which wasn't great for the nobles. All right, let's see. We've got time for at least Greece, probably Belgium as well. We still got like 20 minutes. All right. So, Greece. Greece was still under the control of the Ottoman Empire during the time of Napoleon. It's been under the control of the Ottoman Empire since, well, at least the 1500s. The ideas of Enlightenment reached the Greeks, especially the Greeks that weren't in Greece. So there was a Greek man, Adamantios Koreus, who was living in Paris, and he created what is really a new Greek language. Because the Greeks living in Greece didn't speak Greek. They spoke, I guess, Turkish or Arabic, whatever it is the Turkish speak. Because they had been under their rule for like 300 years at this point. So he went back and used like ancient Greek to create this new Greek language to try to unify the dialects and make like a single language for nationalistic causes. In fact, as I mentioned, our nerdy founding fathers were big into like ancient Greek, and a few of them actually went to Greece during, I guess it was either before or after the American Revolution, and they were shocked because no one in Greece spoke Greek, or at least the ancient Greek that they knew. It's like, yeah, guys, it's been like 1,000 years. What are you guys doing? So Koreus created this new form of Greek out of the ancient Greek language. So we've got these various groups in the region, Serbs, Bulgarians, and Romanians that were all agitating for independence, but were typically and brutally put down by often the Austrians or whatever other groups were in power. So the Romanian Greek leader, Alexander, I don't know how much of that is silent, so I'm going to pretend is Silantis, was not able to get the Romanians or Serbs on board, so he went with his third option and started a Greek rebellion in 1821. And so the Greeks rebelled against the Turks, and this war was won in part due to a lot of folks in Europe and America joining in. The elites had been schooled to respect Greek culture as like the root of Western civilization. I mean, we literally started the semester last year. Well, I mean, we started with Mesopotamia, but then we went into Greece, because Greece is like a major part of Western civilization, and that's what they had been taught. And we had a bunch of Europeans going over to help in the war. We had a bunch of Americans going over to help in the war. We actually had, for example, where are we? Lord Byron died in a battle there. You may know his name. He was like a poet. Yeah, it was one of many revolutions that happened, and it largely succeeded because all the European elites were like, oh, that's where our civilization comes from, so we better go help. So it ended in 1829, and by 1832 they had put together a stable government with help from Europe, which is to say Europe was going to obviously be involved because they felt like they should make sure that Greece was going to be run the way they felt it should be run. So they had a Bavarian king put in charge. Nobody liked him. By 1864, he was kicked out, And the Danish king, George the First was put in charge. I don't actually know who's. I'm pretty sure Greece is just like a regular old democracy now. I don't think they've got a king. I don't know why they had a Danish king there at the end, but that's the whole thing. This is the picture that's in the book. This is by Eugene Delacroix. Greece expiring on the ruins of Miscellany. Ottoman forces overran the Greek town of Miscellany. This is where Lord Byron had died. Avenging themselves on the Greeks by executing several thousand Greek men and selling women and children into slavery. This painting was meant to call Europe's attention to the plight of the Greeks. So yeah, there was a lot of this. Like I said, our founding fathers were super into this as well. I had a whole class in grad school on like classical. It was called a classical America, which was just like our founding fathers being a bunch of Greek and Roman nerds, and like how so much of our stuff was based on like the classical era. And it was weird though too, because like I took this when I was in Rhode Island, and I'm from obviously around here, and we've got all the buildings with like the columns and stuff. It's like, yeah, no, I'm from a place where we've got columns on all of our buildings. All right, let's talk about Belgium. And actually, we should be able to, because then there's one more like small section, and then we'll be able to finish this section of the chapter. So, as we mentioned at the start of the chapter, drawing arbitrary lines doesn't go real well. Because when you draw lines on a map and you have nobody from that region of the world telling you whether that's going to be a good idea or not, it's probably going to be a bad idea. See, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, all of Israel, so many places where just some dude drew a line on a map and it ended up being a problem. Needless to say, the Kingdom of the Netherlands was one such case. The Spanish Netherlands was largely French-speaking and Catholic. The king was Protestant, Wilhelm I. Also, there was a lot of unemployment when the British textiles put thousands out of work, and they rebelled. This wasn't seen as affecting the great powers, so the continent of Europe didn't move in to do anything about it. But they did insist that the king of this new region, which was going to be called Belgium, have, quote, mixed loyalties. This is going to come back to be a problem. Keep this in mind. So, the king, Leopold I, was a German princeling who was married to Princess Charlotte, second in line for the British throne. In 1839, the great powers signed the Treaty of London, which guaranteed Belgian neutrality. Yeah, so specifically England and Prussia, again, the center of what will become Germany, agreed that they would respect the neutrality of Belgium. This will become a problem in 1914. So here's this map here. This also actually shows you a good idea of like what the German states look like. You've got this big old Prussia here. You've got the Rhine, Hesse, Nassau, Waldeck, Lippe. There's Hanover. See, Hanover's pretty big. Oldenburg, Hamburg, Bremen, all these little places. Bavaria. I mean, heck, even in the Netherlands, you see they've got all these little states. But yeah. So this becomes Belgium. And this becomes what is the modern day Netherlands. we'll see this picture again in the future. Um, this is a British World War One enlistment poster. The scrap of paper the Germans have broken their pledged word to in devastated Belgium. Help to keep your German country's honor bright by restoring Belgium her liberty. Enlist today. Signatures and seals of the representatives of the Six Powers to the scrap of paper, the treaty signed in 1839 guaranteeing the independence of Belgium, the neutrality of Belgium. Sorry, independence and independence of Belgium. Blah, blah, blah. Palmerston signed for Britain, Bulow for Prussia. So yeah, that's the Treaty of London there. All right, let's do this last one, and then we'll be done for this section. So there were some attempts at nationalistic joining together, and they didn't all work. For example, we had an attempt at joining Italy. As I said, this happens later. So some lands were handed back to the Pope and conservative princes. Some liberal Italians wanted independence. We had the Carbonari, or charcoal burners. I guess that was their job. Young Italy under Giuseppe Mazzini. Both failed in their aims, but Mazzini managed to avoid prison, which is like about as surprising as Sieyès surviving. He didn't get in prison for trying to rebel against Italy in a time when, like, you look at somebody wrong and get thrown in prison. In Germany, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm collected old fairy tales and stories to prove this unified people among all disparate German principalities. This is where we get the Grimm fairy tales, because they were proving that despite we have all these different German principalities, we all have the same like folk tales and stories and stuff because we're very similar people. However, they were apparently too liberal and got fired from their jobs as professors at the University of Göttingen in Hanover in 1837. Apparently collecting fairy tales was too liberal. I don't know. And in Poland, November 1830, there was a revolt and the short Russo-Polish War. Tens of thousands of Poles were killed, evacuated, or shipped off to Siberian prison camps. Yeah, Poland's just always getting the worst of it. So, sorry, Poland. You'll get your country back later. So here's Mazzini and the Brothers Grimm. And these guys are great. These are the Hussars. These are the the Polish Hussars. This is the last time they were used in battle. They date back to the Middle Ages, and they were like the greatest cavalry force in Europe at the time. But back in the Middle Ages, they had this really cool armor that had like these two metal pieces that went up, and they would basically attach feathers to them, and they were the winged hussars. And when they came into battle, most of the time the other guys would just run because they were just like, we're not dealing with the winged hussars. Like they were just renowned all over Europe as just being, you didn't mess with them. But by this point, you had cannons and muskets and stuff, and cavalry's charge was still dangerous, but charging into cannons wasn't that great. So this was the final charge of the Hussars. It's very, very poignant. A lot of Poles still remember this. This is like one of their big tragedies in their history. I figured I would include it because it's a really cool part of their collective history. I think that's it. Yeah, we'll get into domestic politics next week. So I'll see y'all on Monday. And as I was telling